The Lord be with you. A reading from the Gospel of Q. At that time, Jesus entered Capernaum, and a Roman officer there had a favorite servant who was sick and near death. Hearing about Jesus, the centurion sent some Jewish elders to ask him to come and heal his servant. They came to Jesus and pleaded urgently with him. "He deserves your help," they said. "He is a friend of our people. In fact, he's the one who built our synagogue." Jesus was not very far from the house when the centurion approached him and said, "My servant is lying at home, paralyzed and in great pain." Jesus said to him, "I will come and cure him." The centurion replied, "I don't deserve to have you in my house. Just say the word and my servant will be healed. After all, I myself am under orders, and I have many soldiers under my command. I say to one, 'Go,' and he goes. I order another one to come, and he comes. And to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed and said to the crowd following him, "I tell you, nowhere in Israel have I found such faith." Then Jesus said to the centurion, "Go home now, and everything will happen as you believed it would." At that moment, the servant was healed. A scripture inspired by God. There are people who have questions, but they don't have answers. And then there are people who have answers, but they don't have questions. We call these people politicians. They rarely answer the questions actually being asked. They have answers, but they're not pertinent to the questions being asked. And then there's a whole group of people who don't have either questions or answers. And in order to help this latter group, there's been a whole genre of literature over the last 25 years that I call the Simpleton series. It's like quantum mechanics for the simpleton, or a history of the papacy for the simpleton, or jam making for the simpleton. But long, long, long before there was the Simpleton series, we had the catechisms, which are basically the same thing. You didn't have to think of the questions yourselves. We thought of the questions for you, and then we gave you the answers as well. And I fell into this trap myself. The very first book I wrote it in Swahili, and it's called Ukweli ni Nini, the truth, what does that mean? And it was a catechism basically. But it was a catechism that I wrote in the form of a story. It was a story of a Christ child visiting a village in Africa and hanging out with the kids for a week's time as they're tending their cattle and their sheep, and the rapport that went on and the questions and answers that went on before them. But it's basically a catechism. And then I came to the States, and at some stage I was moved from one church to St. Aloysius Rectory on El Camino. And when I went in there was some books left over by a previous occupant. They were dusty and mouldy and had obviously been rarely read. And I threw them all out. I wasn't interested in any of them except one. An old paperback copy of the Baltimore Catechism. And I still have it. I treasure it. No, I still have it. I still have it. And I've delved into it occasionally to look at the really fun parts like limbo and how come nobody can get to heaven except Catholics, stuff like that. But you were all raised in this if you were Catholics. You know, the basic questions. We asked the basic questions for you, and we gave you the answers because you weren't intelligent enough to think of the questions, so we thought of them on your behalf. Like, who made the world, or who is God? So we thought of all these kinds of questions for you. But this catechism has a long, long, long history. So the very first catechism was the reading that Michael did for us today. The Didache was really the first catechism. It's ascribed to the apostles. So when the apostles began to try to talk about what the basic teachings of Jesus were about, they put together this little compendium that's called the Didache. And it goes way, way back. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to make basically three main points. Firstly, I want to talk about the stages of moral development. And then I'm going to talk about choose life or choose death. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk about the stages of learning how to love. So they're the three I'll make this morning. So there's probably nobody in the church this morning who hasn't done Psych 101. Yeah? And if you've done Psych 101, part of what you learned was Kohlberg's stages of moral evolution. Lawrence Kohlberg was a professor in Harvard, and he wanted to try to study how do people evolve in their moral decision making. And the system he put in place was he would propose a scenario to people, hundreds and hundreds of people, and ask them how would they make moral choices based on this scenario. A typical one was like, a man's wife is dying of a rare disease, but the cure for it is really, really costly and he can't afford it. And he's passing a chemist shop one day and he sees it inside and there's nobody around. Will he break the glass and steal it in order to save his wife's life? So these were the kind of scenarios he proposed. And then people would give their answers. And he wasn't so much interested in the decisions they made. He was much more interested in the process by which they arrived at their decision. And he basically concluded that people go through 3 stages of moral development if they continue to evolve. That the first stage, he called it pre-conventional, or egoic is another word for it. At this stage of moral thinking, the only idea is I want to be rewarded for whatever I do, or I need to avoid punishment so as I don't get caught. And it's the thinking of the little child from birth to about age 6 or 7. So the basic operating modality is I don't want to get caught with my hand in the cookie jar, so I'll try not to do it, or I want mommy to think I'm a really good boy and I'll be rewarded for something. So our moral choices at this stage, stage 1, tend to be about avoiding punishment or getting rewarded. That's stage 1. Well, stage 2 is a little bit more advanced. About age 7 or so, kids develop the use of reason. And so for the first time ever, they can be taught the rules of their culture and the roles being assigned to them. Depending on their gender and their culture and their ethnic group whatsoever, they'll be assigned particular roles. So a 7-year-old in Kenya, for instance, would be minding cattle and sheep. 7-year-old here is expected to be in 2nd grade. So depending on the culture, we're given different roles and different rules. And at this stage, the child, for the first time ever, is able to enter into some kind of a social contract with the culture. And so the second stage of moral development is that a child will make a decision based on the agreement that he's made with the culture or with the society. So it's not primarily about reward or punishment, it's about this is how I have to be in order to be a member of this group. And the third stage, so that's called conventional moral thinking or ethnocentric part of the group. The third stage is post-conventional thinking, and here's where a person is attempting to make decisions on the basis of what's really right. Not on the basis of reward or punishment, not even on the social contract, because we realize there are some times when the social contract is inadequate. And so we have to make decisions beyond that. And the great religious traditions pick up on this. This is stage 3, of what I would call eco-thinking. Not ego or not ethno, but eco-thinking for the much bigger group. So there were the stages through which Kohlberg led us. But Kohlberg is just putting in paper or putting in some kind of a map what the great religious traditions had been practicing and working their ways through for thousands of years before that. And so I want to use Kohlberg's model to go back and look at some of the scriptures and some of the religious traditions behind them, which brings me to my second point. The opening line of the Didache today proposed the following. This is my second point then. You can choose life or you can choose death. There are 2 possibilities. Now, many of the great teachers throughout history and many of the great religious founders used this line very effectively. Most effectively of all, perhaps, Moses. When you read the book of Deuteronomy, particularly chapters 28 through 30, it's Moses' final homily. Moses has arrived right on the edge of the promised land, but he's not allowed to go in. God is punishing him for his impatience 40 years before. So he's not going to be allowed to go into the promised land. But God brings him up onto a plateau in the land of Moab, and he shows him the land and he says, this is where I'm going to bring your people in. Now talk to them for one last time because you're going to die. You're not going to go into the promised land. And Moses gives a 4-chapter long homily, 4 main points. He talks to the people about life and death. And the culmination, the climax of his homily says, today I set before you life and death. Choose life. And I'll tell you what will happen if you choose life, and I'll tell you in exquisite detail what will happen if you choose death. Choosing life means keeping the covenant with Yahweh, and choosing death means abandoning the covenant with Yahweh. If you choose the covenant with Yahweh, here are the blessings you will receive. God will demolish all your enemies in front of you. You will conquer the land completely. The land will be yours. It will be a very fertile land, a land flowing with milk and honey, meeting all your needs. Moreover, God will make you fruitful yourself. He will bless your wombs, and you will have many, many, many children. So there are the blessings if you choose life. If you choose death, now let me walk to my topic, because Moses is basically a fire and brimstone guy. So he expands for the next 3 chapters on what happens if you choose death. If you abandon the covenant, here's what will happen. God will send your enemies to punish you. You'll be conquered and you'll be exiled. Moreover, if you get into the land itself will prove to be infertile. It won't meet your needs. There will be constant famine. And you yourselves will be infertile. You won't give birth to children. And then he goes on and on and on, chapter after chapter, telling how bad it's going to get. And he says, for instance, God is going to visit you with, and I kid you not, Egyptian boils, eczema, tumors, the itch, whatever that is, blindness, madness, panic attacks. He threw in the DSM-4 just for good measure. Moreover, and I'm not joking you, no, really getting graphic at this stage, he says, the most refined woman among you, she who would not let the heel of her foot touch the ground, she will eat her own firstborn, and the rest of the family will scrabble for the afterbirth. How graphic can you get? This is what happens if you choose not to keep the covenant. Now, the leader of Didache is offering the same choices, but with very, very different consequences. The leader of Didache today, the writer of Didache is saying, today I set before you life and death. And here's what life looks like. It's a very different scenario. It's not about killing enemies. It's not about fertility. It's not about the fruit of the land. He said, here's what happens if you choose life. You will love God. You will love your neighbor. You will love your enemy. You will not do to anybody what you do not want them to do to you. And the reward for doing all of this, it's not land or kids or conquest, it's you shall become like God. So it's a totally different scenario. And when he talks about if you choose death, he's basically saying if you choose to steal or tell lies or kill people or whatever, there'll be social anarchy. But he's not graphic about it. He's really graphic about what happens when you choose life. So it's a totally different scenario. Which brings me to the third point I want to make. I want to suggest that we learn how to love in 4 very different stages. And the first stage of learning how to love is learning how to love myself. And that's really, really important. The first 2 years, particularly of our life, are basically narcissistic years in which if we weren't complete narcissists, we would not survive. It is the little baby's instinct to make themselves the center of the universe that allows them to survive intact in this little spacesuit of ours. They have to become the center of attention. They can basically only breathe for themselves. They have to be fed and cared and protected and nurtured. So if they weren't completely narcissistic, if they didn't learn how to love themselves completely, they would not survive. Now this is very appropriate then. The first stage of learning how to love is to learn how to love oneself. But of course, all of these have shadow sides. And if at the age of 35, I'm still narcissistically self-engrossed, then what happens is I create bedlam, because if everybody else is acting in the same fashion, there is absolute anarchy. So this looks like the moral stage development of Kohlberg. It's like stage 1. Narcissism is stage 1. But there is a place for it, and there's a time for it in the human trajectory. But left to its own devices, if it doesn't grow into stages 2 and 3, it creates total social breakdown. And so we're invited into stage 2. And stage 2 of love is learning how to love my neighbor. It is realizing that there's something beyond the self, that there's the immediate family, and then there's the clan, and then there's the tribe. And so it's ethnocentric kind of thinking. It's making the social contract. It's the child at age 7 being able for the first time ever to appreciate that there are others here and that I need to make some kind of a social agreement in order that I get my needs met and other people get their needs met. And so we enter into social contracts as families, or as clans, or as tribes, or nations, or denominations, into bigger and bigger groups. And this is really important. It allows us to create some kind of social stability. The problem is, mostly it tends to stop right there. And there's a huge shadow side to that. The shadow side is it promotes animosity, and it promotes racism, and it promotes prejudices of all kind. There was a time in human history when that was appropriate, just like there's a time in the individual history when it's appropriate to be narcissistic. We wouldn't survive otherwise. There was a time in human history going back 4,000 years when it perhaps was appropriate to be ethnocentric and to be tribalistic in our thinking. But that time is long since gone. And so Moses had no compunction about advocating and practicing genocide. Anybody who was not one of us was our enemy. And so again and again and again, people are put under what's called euphemistically the ban. The ban meant that when you conquered your enemy, you killed every man, every woman, and every child, and sometimes even the livestock. There's a very graphic account in the book of Joshua, in chapter 6, verse 21, when the Israelites cross into the promised land for the first time, and they meet the first city, Jericho, which is possibly the oldest continually inhabited city on planet Earth, and they attacked it and demolished it. And chapter 6, verse 21 is Joshua's final command to the Israelite troops. He said, every man goes straight ahead and kill every man, every woman, every child, every ox, and every camel. There is no living thing to be left at the end of the day. And that was the morality of the time. And strangely enough, that was a huge advance on stage one. That's stage two moral thinking. This is the social contract. But anybody outside the social group doesn't count. We got a totally different response to people outside the social group. 4,000 years ago, it was an advance. Moses represented a huge leap forward in human moral thinking, from narcissistic self-engrossment to thinking ethnocentrically about the tribal grouping. A huge move forward, but that was 4,000 years ago. About 2,000 years ago came another great Jewish teacher, Jesus Christ, and he advocated the third stage of learning to love. And this is learning to love your enemy. It's a totally different understanding. Learning to love your enemy. It totally changes the equation. And of course, it is really, really difficult. We have to totally redefine. Has it been practiced? In 2,000 years of Christianity, I've only found 2 instances where this has been practiced in international diplomacy. One by a Hindu and one by a Buddhist, none by Christian leaders. One by Gandhi in the 1930s and 40s, and by the Dalai Lama perhaps in our own times. I don't know of any Christian country which has made this a cornerstone of their foreign policy. And it is really upsetting to me to hear fundamentalist Christian preachers who have a national audience, or allegedly Christian politicians who have an international audience, claiming to be Christian, but focusing totally on stuff which is largely irrelevant, or certainly not as important as this. They're focused on euthanasia, or they're focused on abortion, or they're focused on stem cell research, or they're focused on reproductive rights, or they're focused on homosexuality. But I have never heard a fundamentalist preacher at a national level, or a Christian politician at a national, international level say, how about loving our enemies? Could we make that a cornerstone of our foreign policy? I've never heard these preachers come to it. I've never heard these politicians come to it, in spite of the fact that we've been claiming for 2,000 years that we're followers of Jesus Christ. So this very obviously is an injunction more honored in the breach than in the observance. Only non-Christian politicians have managed to do it, a Hindu and a Buddhist. Now, part of the reason we're stuck in this old mentality, we're still operating in the Mosaic model. We're still operating in the model proposed by Moses. Jesus attempted to lift us into stage 3 thinking in the moral evolution, in Kohlberg's moral evolution. It's doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And Jesus was not the only one, or not even the first one, to get to that place. Buddhism had arrived there. The Buddha's teaching on right action. Right action is the ability to do something because it's the right thing to do. Not because I want to get rewarded, not because I fear punishment, not even because I have a social contract, but because it's the right thing to do. Hinduism got there even before Jesus in the teaching of Karmic Yoga. There are different kinds of yoga in the Hindu model. Karmic Yoga, or the Karmic Yogi, is the person who does the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And they illustrate that with a very interesting example. They tell the story of a Karmic Yogi who's sitting on the banks of the Ganges with a group of his disciples. And there's a shrub growing out over the river. And a scorpion crawls into the shrub and falls into the river and has been swept downstream and is drowning. And the yogi fishes him out. And the scorpion stings him. And the yogi releases the scorpion. The disciples are watching this performance. About a half an hour later, the very same scorpion crawls onto the bush, falls into the water again, is being swept downstream and is drowning. And the yogi goes in and fishes him out, and the scorpion stings him again. And this happens 3 times. And finally, one of the disciples says, dude, get a clue. You know, he keeps stinging you. And the yogi says, yes, it is the nature of a scorpion to sting. That's what they're built to do. And it is the nature of a yogi to help a being who's in distress. I'm not doing it because I expect he'll be grateful or that I'm going to get some kind of reward in heaven. I'm doing it because I'm a yogi. That's what yogis do. They help beings who are in distress. So the yogis, Hinduism had got to the same place, and Buddhism had got to the same place as Jesus did. It is right action, doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. But I want to suggest this morning that there's a 4th stage of learning how to love. And I believe that the reason we're stuck at stage 2 and have never managed to get to stage 3, in spite of 2,000 years of Christian history, is that in order to move the action from stage 2 to stage 3, you have to move the fulcrum from stage 3 to stage 4. You have no leverage if the fulcrum is back where it used to be. You have to move the fulcrum in order to apply the leverage to move the system from stage 2 to stage 3. What do I mean by that? Stage 4 for me is learning how to love all sentient beings. Love does not stop at loving myself. It doesn't stop at loving my neighbor or my tribe. It doesn't even stop at loving my enemy. Unless I've learned how to love all sentient beings, there is no way we are going to move the culture of our times from stage 2 thinking, where we're definitely stuck after 4,000 years, to stage 3 thinking of really considering my enemy and a shadow aspect of myself. Only if we have a new fulcrum. And I want to suggest that that fulcrum is the love and regard for all sentient beings. And only then, it seems to me, can we make truly moral choices or truly be moral people. Only then will we get it that there's a unity underlying all of diversity and that there's an emptiness underlying all form. And so it is our love for nature that will bring us to that place. And I would say that the chief culprit, the main reason why 2,000 years after Jesus Christ, that we still haven't reached stage 3, is that we have been on a rampant, ravaging rape of planet Earth and its resources. We've seen it as stuff and things as our resource, using the Hebrew word radah. Radah has 3 different meanings in Hebrew. It means to have the right to dominate, to despoil, or to be responsible for. We've chosen the first 2 reasons. And because of a 2,000-year history of ravaging the planet and seeing it merely as resources, we have been unable to shift from stage 2 moral thinking into stage 3 moral thinking. We need to shift the fulcrum, which means what? It means going back to nature with fresh eyes. We can only love nature and respect nature when we see nature. I mean, really see nature. And we can only see nature if we choose to spend regular quality time actually watching and observing nature. I would like to suggest as an exercise for all of us, if we really want to do something small and simple that will shift the consciousness of our times and create a 4th fulcrum that will move our thinking from stage 2 to stage 3, it is to spend quality time watching the little things in nature. And so to end with, I want to just share a tiny little story or an essay I wrote on the 29th of January this year, up in my home in Hillsburg as I was out trekking one day. It's called The Banana Slug. I'm sitting on a fallen redwood tree, thinking cosmic thoughts, and writing frantic reminders to myself in my little spiral notebook, lest the insights be lost. Between thoughts, I look around seeking inspiration and to rest my brain, which is threatening to burst with its labor pains. I spy a long, slender, slimy banana slug in fatigues. He is wearing a camouflage skin suit of mustard green, dappled with black spots. Hundreds of tiny legs allow him to navigate the rough terrain. He climbs over and under twigs and leaves and stones. He can telescope his eye-bearing antennae, sometimes both together, sometimes individually. Where is he going? Does he have a GPS system? Did he have a plan in mind this morning when he started his journey? Will he return home tonight? Does he have a home? Or is he a perpetual nomad, a Christ-commissioned apostle, commanded to not take any possessions for the trip? And what good news has he come to preach? Is he here to remind me of the Master's words, look at the lilies of the field, slowly slithering slug, you are a very eloquent preacher, a tireless traveler advocating Christ consciousness. May God bless your ministry. May she open our eyes. Safiri Salama.